So necessary leadership. So the logs that I bring for this fire that we're creating together, I think is about what Rainbow Hawk talked about calling forth. What do we need to call forth from ourselves, and what do we need to call forth from each other? Now, Woody Allen, who some of you may know and have enjoyed, once said that success, 90% of success, was turning up. So let me congratulate you all for having done the most important thing today, turning up. And perhaps we can discover what the other 10% is. But turning up is not that simple. I think Sue's just brilliantly talked about to really turn up with our head, our hearts, our guts, our hands, to be fully present to what awaits us. What does that mean to fully turn up? And why have I turned up today? Because my diary tells me that I should be teaching the other side of London. So why did I decide to come today? What am I here for? How do I ask that question? Well, I'm here because when Nick asked me, there was something about this inquiry which was very important for me. You see, I've just turned 60. I've had the privilege of turning 60. And by the time all my predecessors were 60, they were either dead or retired. And so I thought, well, what I needed to do is to ask myself the question that I've asked so many leaders that I've coached about their business and about themselves. And that question is a very simple question, but in other ways very important. I started to ask myself the question, what is it that I can uniquely do that the world of tomorrow needs? It's my one-line definition of strategy. There's so many books written about strategy. Actually, I think strategy comes down to this one question. And when I asked myself that question, I said, well, let's start with the second half. What is it that the world of tomorrow needs that I can make a contribution to? And when I thought about that, I started to think, well, we live in exciting times. Tim Schmidt, who some of you know, who started the Eden Project, opened a speech recently in which he said, the next 30 years are one of the most exciting times to be alive. That raised the spirits of the audience. But he then said, because in the next 30 years, we're either going to decide and discover how Homo is truly sapiens, or we're going to join the fossil records. Now, that's quite a stark choice. This person from the United Nations who talked about dealing with so many problems around the world, he said basically when it came down to it, there was only one main challenge, and that was that our technology, the greatness of our knowledge and our technological expertise has got so far ahead of our wisdom that there's a gap. How do we close that gap? Now, when I started to ask that question of myself, I started to think, how many times when I'm coaching, when I'm teaching, when I'm writing, am I passing on knowledge? Have I become just a merchant of skill? Or how many times am I helping others by evoking their wisdom, connecting them with their wisdom, connecting them with the wisdom that's beyond them? This lovely Sufi poem from Sanai, knowledge without wisdom is like an unlit candle. But when you think of that quote, well, actually, what does that mean? That means we have to set fire to our knowledge so it starts to burn. What does that mean? When I work with leaders so often, it's not about learning, it's about unlearning. What do we have to unlearn to be fully present? What do we need to unlearn to move further on? So the next thing when I thought about what does the world need? Well, actually, one of the biggest things I'm concerned about right now is Nick beautifully talked about the challenges for the leaders of tomorrow. And when I look at my children, I look at my grandchildren, I think, actually, one thing we can guarantee about the future is that the leaders of tomorrow will face far, far bigger challenges than anyone who is part of the privileged generation that I lived in. Unless we are helping them now grow their capacities to meet those challenges, we are letting down the next generation. That's one thing that concerns me. And if I look at, I'm clearly part of a multi-billion-dollar leadership development business around the world. There's earning lots of money. But actually one of the things I'm concerned about is the gap between the challenges and the growth of challenges for leaders and what's happening in the leadership development business, I think is getting bigger and bigger. So one of the things I want to discover from you today is, what is it we can do as leaders, as coaches, as people working in leadership development to close that gap, to find new ways of developing on many planes, not just on one. So what is it you can uniquely do? What is your particular note within that is a question I think we all have to answer. Not what is it that I can do that people want, but what is it that if I'm not singing that note will not be sung. Now, what is leadership? This is a bit of self-quoting. One of my favorite quotes, not just because it was in my own book, but leadership is not a role, it's an attitude. You see, I work with so many people to say, well, what do I have to do in order that somebody makes me a leader? And why I like this quote, leadership begins when we stop blaming others or making excuses, is because daily I fall foul of my own quote. 6 a.m. this morning, there was at least 3 emails where in my head, as I read the emails, I was starting to get defensive. I was starting to say, what they don't understand, and if they did, they wouldn't have sent me that email, was. And I find myself starting to blame the other that sent the email. I find myself making an excuse. But what happens for me now is that light bulb goes on. It says, well, right now, Peter, you have chosen to step out of leadership. You've chosen, and sometimes I need to step out of leadership, but at that moment, I've stopped occupying the space that is needed, which is to actually attend to what is it they need me to hear. But let me give you another quote, one of my favorite quotes, from Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Sufi poet from the 12th century. Leadership is a poison, except for the one who possesses the antidote in his heart. I went off to speak in Turkey about what could Western Europe learn from Turkey about leadership. Extraordinary, privileged invitation. And I searched all the poetry of Rumi to try and find something I could take which captured something. And I found this one line, such a pearl of a line. What is, leadership is a poison unless we have the antidote in our hearts. What are the antidotes that we possess? Because what does leadership do? Yeah? As soon as you step into leadership, all sorts of expectations are put on you. All sorts of pressures are put on you. What are the antidotes that we carry? Now, one of the problems about leadership, one of the poisons, is that we think that leadership resides in leaders. So we're always looking for the person who's going to sort out our organization, the person who's going to sort out Britain, the next political leader who we will build up so that they are bound to disappoint us. But leadership is never in an individual. It is always relational. You cannot have leadership unless you have a leader, some followers, and a shared endeavor. And the third is really important, because there's a lot being written about followership, but not about this triangulation. What happens if you have a leader and an endeavor and no followers, where you get a voice crying in the wilderness? What happens if you have followers and an endeavor but no leadership? You have a sort of aimless crowd waiting for Godot. But most interesting for our society today is what happens if you have a leader and a follower and no endeavor. Do you know what you get? Celebrity stalking. Yeah? And how much of that do we read in the papers or see on television, where we're looking for leadership, but actually leadership is as much created by the endeavor which is shared which is co-created as it is by the leader or the followers. The triangle. And actually, if you look at that triangle, to be a successful leader, I need to focus not just on the endeavor, because if I focus just on the endeavor, I become totalitarian. I need to not just focus on the followers. If I do, I'm just currying favor. I need to find my focus which balances those two. If I'm a follower, I just don't need to focus on the leader, otherwise it is celebrity stalking. Or just on the endeavor, but how do I focus on what is there in that triangulated space? And another poison. You see, if I look around this room, and the people I know in this room, like myself, we are an incredibly privileged group. And I don't mean just the privilege of wealth, of health, of family, but the privilege of our color, the privilege of our education, the privilege of what we have access to, the privilege of choice that we have. And yet, what I think is that, I think it was Socrates who said many years ago, the thing about wealth is that it can lead to indulgence and burden. Unless we invest our privilege, it would decay and it would decay us. What are we going to do to invest our privilege? What does our privilege allow us to uniquely do? And how are you going to invest your privilege? But what we need to remember is that leadership is also collective. You know, Nick talked about it being distributed, but it's also collective. So in my book I've just finished writing about leadership teams, one of the things I realized that in the world, if we're going to face some of those challenges that Nick talked about, none of that can be done by heroic leaders. And so many of us can get into the poison of believing we have to be heroic, we have to take more on. And if we look at what we know about leadership development, we know far more about developing individuals than we do about developing real, effective, collective leadership teams. Now, how many teams do you come across where the brilliance of the individuals shines out? I think it was Peter Senge who said, how many teams do you go into where each person has an IQ over 120, but the team functions at an IQ about 62? Yeah? You recognize those sorts of teams? How do we help collective teams work together to be more than the sum of their parts? How do we develop? You see, I worked a lot, we're looking at the government, about how come the last government between 1997 and 2010 spent more money on leadership development than all previous governments put together. Yeah? And yet every single government department, when they did the capability review of the government department, every single one said, we have a real challenge around the lack of capability of our senior leadership team. But you see, what happened is, what did we do with that leadership development? We sent all the individuals off individually on cognitive-based courses, one by one, and yet what needed to be developed was the spaces between them. So how do we have development that develops the space between the leader, the endeavor, and the followers, and doesn't just fall into this trap that we have to develop the individual? Because the challenges that Nick outlined will not be dealt with by heroic leaders. It'll only be dealt with if we can take responsibility for ourselves, but can then get a team around us who will hold us to account, who will hold us to our truth, that will manage our weaknesses, will be the antidote to our poison, and who will work with us to create that connectivity, to create the collective leadership with the endeavor and with the followers that's needed to go forward. So I offer these few logs to add to our fire and look forward to finding out from you later today, how can we close that gap? How can we step up to our own leadership? How can we create collective leadership? But also, how can we help the next generation meet the challenges that they're going to have to face? Thank you.